Cupcake Candles. A flush of happiness and pride at having only one candle left out of the 12 she had had in her tray at the start of the evening had settled down into a comforting warmth by the time she quietly unlocked the front door and entered the small apartment. She knew that her mother would already be in bed and hopefully fast asleep. She wasn't going to wake her up, knowing full well that she would have been told once again that her now swollen belly and obvious pregnancy was, seem to have gone adrift here, pregnancy, that the only reason for that, why she had sold more candles that evening than ever before, was that they felt pity on you. She knew that pity was the one thing her daughter didn't need and in fact despised. But that did nothing to change the mood of the young woman. All that mattered was that tomorrow she would be making another deposit in the bank account she had opened after her first night of hawking candles in the restaurants in the center of town. She put a bundle of notes and coins from her pocket on the table and counted them. 11 candles at 20 rand each added up to 220 rand. She had counted 210. The missing 10 rand did not bother her. She knew where it had gone. She also knew that 9 months earlier, when she hadn't yet known that a new life had started to grow inside her, a moment like this would have been one to pour out the half glass of Tassenberg left on the table, and light a cigarette. Now she knew better. So instead it was a mug of still hot tea from the thermos flask her mother had left for her before going to bed. It was after her third sip of the tea that she surprised herself for the second time that evening by surrendering to a sudden impulse. She picked up the box of matches lying on the table and lit the remaining candle that she had carried home so proudly. She then switched off the light. At 20 rand a candle, it was an extravagant gesture, but she felt entitled to it. After all, she hadn't had an extravagant impulse for all of 9 months now, and she had always so loved yielding to them without reckoning of the cost or consequences. She stared lovingly at the little flame on top of the wax candle. They really were beautiful. Every second of their soft golden light surely worth every cent of the 20 rand she charged. Her pride in her creation had been challenged a few days earlier when she had walked into a gift shop hoping that they would be just as admiring of her creation and stock a batch of them. She chose a moment when there were no customers in the shop. It started off well enough. The elderly lady behind the counter had unquestionably admired them. But then, with one of her beautiful candles in her hand, she had asked, "What scent do they have?" The look of confusion on the young woman's face had not needed words. "You mean they don't have any scent?" "But my dear, gift candles always have a scent." She was right. Going to the shelf where all the gift candles were on display, she read the labels: vanilla, lavender, Mexican rose. There was even one ugly fat one that not only gave off the scent of burning cedar wood, but also made crackling noises like a cozy fire in the grate. a young woman left the shop with the 3 candles she had brought with her. All of them with the little wicks sticking out of dollops of bright coloured wax right on top. She had melted down ordinary colouring in book crayons to achieve that. But now, how to give them scent? Her first impulse was to ignore the remark that all gift candles must have scent. Unfortunately, rising to challenges was as much a part of her nature as was surrendering to extravagant impulses. Here now was the next challenge, and she decided she would rise to it the next day with a visit to the women's section in Clicks to see what they had in the way of perfumes that she could possibly mix with the molten wax. She poured herself another cup of tea and then found the place in the cupboard where her mother had hidden the sugar. She heard her mother's voice again. "It's not good for the baby." After 2 spoonfuls of sugar, she once again settled down at the table. The candle was still burning, its flame now floating at the bottom of a little well of molten wax. Behind her on the stove, her mother had laid out all that was needed for another batch. A pot for melting down 3 long white household candles, those in the blue packets. Every supermarket has them. A pair of scissors for snipping their long wicks into lengths suitable for her waxen creations. And of course, the cupcake baking tray, now scrubbed and cleaned. Still staring at the burning candle, she tried once again to make sense of it. The candles, the swollen belly, the baby inside her already impatient to be out, judging from the vigor of the kicks she was now living with regularly. And then her mother, bitter and defeated. Why and what? And where had it all begun? Before she was born? When she too was still just a small new life in her mother's womb, and her father abandoned them and disappeared and never returned? Was he maybe one of those sad white men who now stand on street corners holding up a piece of cardboard with a desperate plea for a few rands to feed wife and child? How many other abandoned wives and children were there struggling to survive in the new South Africa? Did she have half-brothers and sisters out there who were also rising to or failing to rise to the survival challenges facing them? Only that very evening, when she paused briefly outside the last of the restaurants she was going to visit and straightened up the wicks of the last 4 candles she had left, an elderly woman had greeted her. He had been standing nearby trying to win a few rand as a car guard. "Naam, dokter. Naam, oom. Wat verkoop jy?" "Cupcake candles, oom." He looked at her tray and nodded. "Hoeveel kos hulle?" "R20. No. He shook his head with a little laugh. Hy het nie vanaand genoeg verdien om selfs net 1 te koop. Nee. All she could say was, "Jammer." She then went inside the restaurant and sold 3, leaving her with the one she was now staring at. When she left the restaurant a few minutes later, he was still there. They greeted each other again. "Het jy iets verkoop?" "Ja, oom. 3 van my kersse." "So moet dit wees." "En oom?" "Nog net 'n paar rand in my sak. Ek dink my eie mense kry skaam vir my. Maar wat help dit om te kla? Of te huil? Ons moet maar net aanvaar. Dis nou ons beurt om swaar te kry. Shaking his head, he gave a bitter little laugh. Jammer, my kind. Moenie hoop verloor nie, oom, sê die jong man. Die nag is nog nie verby nie. Daar staan daarom nog 'n paar klomkarre hier. She had already taken quite a few steps back down Dorp Street when one of those sudden impulses she was trying so hard to control seized her again. She surrendered and went back to the old man and pressed a 10 rand note in his hand. This time the moment had not needed any polite words. But was that maybe why she had done it? Was he possibly the father that had walked out on them? She closed her eyes and tried to remember the old Cargill's face. But all she could remember seeing was sadness and a resignation bordering on defeat. No, that day when a pregnant mother had found herself alone in the world wasn't a moment that answered those urgent little questions about her own life. So maybe it was that night at the Joel, when she got so drunk she didn't know, or more truthfully didn't care about what she was doing, and had had unprotected sex with a man she hardly knew or cared about. What would she say to her daughter when one day she asks her who her daddy was? She knew the man's name, but when she tried to find him, she was told that he had moved to Johannesburg. She had made 2 attempts to try and track him down up there, but when they were all unsuccessful, she had given up the search and started to think seriously about her distraught mother's suggestion that she either find a nice man and get married quickly, or failing that, have an abortion. She closed her eyes and spoke the 2 words which she now either thought or spoke aloud at least 100 times each day, trying to will her body into delivering what she wanted, what she needed. My daughter, my daughter, my daughter. Shifting the emphasis between the 2 words each time. It had become her mantra of hope. She was so desperate for the new life inside her to be a girl that she actively wished that, young as she was, her religious skepticism always stopped her from praying for him. Yes, that is what she was hoping for, and would have prayed for if there had been something to believe in. A daughter who she would love and look after and teach how to avoid all the mistakes she had made. She would not force her onto her knees, as her mother had done to her, and make her pray to a God who remained steadfastly indifferent to their prayers and pleased to send her father back to them. She would teach her to believe in herself. A few seconds later, when the little stranger inside her gave a few kicks in, she spoke aloud, and once again with fierce conviction, my daughter, my daughter. She opened her eyes. No. That drunken jaw wasn't the moment that explained everything. It had all started a few weeks after that jaw, when, with her mother's protests ringing in her ears, she had walked out of the abortion doctor's waiting room. That is when my life stopped being the result of other people's mistakes and I made it my own. That is when it became light. But it hadn't been easy. That very night had also been the first of many long, lonely nights when she sat helplessly in the kitchen with the terribly real questions her mother had left her with before going into the bedroom to lie in the dark and cry, always loud enough for her daughter to hear. Helpless and lonely. Until she saw the rusty old cupcake baking tray that they had found in the oven when they moved into the flat, standing then in a corner next to the stove, because out of that, out of nowhere, the idea of cupcake candles had come to her. Now scrubbed and clean, it was there behind her, waiting for another batch of waxen cupcake candles. My daughter, my daughter. There still remained the question of her name. Her mother's contribution had been a list of mothers and sisters in a family tree, all of which she had rejected. When her exasperated mother pressed her for her preferences, all she could say was that it hadn't come to her yet, but that it would. But at that moment, she didn't have enough energy to start on yet another list of possible names, because she was tired. She lowered her head onto her arms on the table and slept. A few hours later, when the candle had already burnt itself out, she finally woke up and opened her eyes. The room was filling slowly with the first light of a new day. The intermittent and muffled sounds of the city also stirring into life were filtering into the room. A distant door slammed in the block of flats. A voice calling. A car starting up in the parking lot down below. And then suddenly, very loud and very near, her mother's alarm clock. It stopped abruptly. She waited. A few minutes later, her mother appeared in the doorway, a ghost in a white nightie. They stared at each other for a few seconds, both pairs of eyes still cobwebbed with sleep. Her mother spoke first, lifting the alarm clock for the daughter to see. It's time, 6 o'clock. She then looked vacantly at the stove. You haven't made any candles. A faint smile hovered on her daughter's lips. Dawn, she said. Her mother's voice hardened. Have you been out all night? Her daughter shook her head. A smile hovering on her lips widened into an unsullied expression of happiness. A new day. For heaven's sake, I know that, was her mother's sharp reply. Have you started drinking again? The smile on the young woman's lips remained unaffected by the rebuke. Her mother's gaze sharpened with suspicion. I found it, said the daughter. What? Asked the mother. The young woman spoke with gentle conviction. Dawn. A new day. That is going to be the name. My baby is going to be called Dawn. The end.